How to Be an Artist, Step 37, The Golden Shadow, with guest Arran Rogerson. All right, Arran Rogerson, is that right?
That's right.
I'm like more concerned about pronouncing the last name than the first name, but it's...
I appreciate that. But yeah, you got it.
Welcome to How to Be an Artist. I'm very excited to have you here. So I first became familiar with your work. I participated in the Rebel Wisdom live player course.
Right.
So that was my first introduction to Golden Shadow, the work you're doing with Alyssa Polizzi.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a really awesome experience with the archetype exercise you guys took us through, and we can talk about that in a little bit. But anyway, shadow has been like a big topic for me over the last couple of years. It's been a really central theme to this podcast. I don't know. Are you a Wizard of Earthsea fan?
No.
You aren't? Okay. That's definitely a book. If you're into the shadow, that's definitely a book you got to check out.
Okay.
But that was where my interest really started. And a shadow plays like a really central role in that narrative.
Okay.
It's kind of a literal battle between a character and a shadow. So, highly recommend it. That was kind of the first thing where I started thinking like, okay, this is interesting stuff. And I got introduced to the concept, and it sent me on kind of this journey. Meditation has played like a big part of it. But yeah, we've had lots of discussions on this podcast about the shadow. So it's cool to like, we'd be able to dig into it in a really, focused way. And also, I mean, as I'm just kind of preparing for this, I just found like so many things that you're talking about and Alyssa is talking about that like really interface with stuff that I'm super interested in. And I was kind of really surprised the stuff that came up as I was kind of like listening to more of your work. So anyway, I think it would be kind of interesting to start kind of with your artistic background and what, if any way, that led you into the interest with the shadow, or if that came kind of from some sort of different direction.
Yeah. I've always been very creative. And as a child, I think I was considered by a lot of my peers and my teachers to be gifted artistically. So that's always been part of my identity, is sort of the strange, talented, arty kid.
Sure.
And so I've always identified with that quite a bit. And it's always been I wouldn't even say interest as much as just sort of an instinct that I've had from a very young age to just create. And, as far as what is my favorite activity, it's creation. I love creating. There's nothing else that feels quite so invigorating, makes you feel alive. And the process of taking nothing and transforming it into something has always been so powerful. And
it's just to ask, I mean, is it almost like, does the medium matter as much as just the process of creation?
The medium doesn't really matter. I mean, and that's part of my experience as well, is I kind of enjoy everything and I'm really interested in everything. And there's kind of this overarching meta synthesizing thing that I'm drawn to, which is like, I want to know about visual art. I want to know about music. I want to know about writing. I want to know about poetry. Like, I want to try all these things and like, what's the universals between them? So the medium doesn't really matter. And the more you explore different mediums, the more you realize they're kind of all the same, right? The same patterns are true for music that are true for visual art. There's nuances that are different, obviously, and there's methods that are different, and there's little tricks for each medium that are kind of unique to that medium. But overall, if you're a good artist in one medium, you can translate that over to other mediums very easily. So
as long as you learn the tools, right, you can figure out how to speak through that thing. Yeah,
absolutely.
Very true.
But my journey with creation, music is really what stood out to me when I was a teenager. And there was something about kind of the edginess or the sexiness, I guess, at the time that really stuck out to me. And I got really into rock music and started recording my own albums of music and performing in bands and stuff like that. And that was a serious endeavor for a while. And that's kind of transformed more recently in the last 5 years into a deeper interest in philosophy and writing and whatever this scene is that we find ourselves right now, right? Rebel wisdom, Stoa. Mm-hmm. There's something happening on the internet that's like emergent. It's new. It's interesting. And I would say that it's very much an art scene, and it might not look that way from the outside, but like there is an art being done here. And it's, what is it the art of? It's like, well, we don't know exactly, but like the art of wisdom, the art of finding other people that can help you learn more about the world and yourself. And there's so much room for creativity in this scene, on this philosophy, sort of wisdom, sense-making scene that I feel like is coming. It's not there yet. It's not a very creative scene yet. You don't see many artists and musicians involved in it, but that's pretty key. And I think it's on its way.
Yeah. Well, that's exciting. It's kind of fun to be like, feel like you're at the kind of front of some sort of like wave or some sort of curve, you know? And that's definitely the sense with like this movement right now.
Yeah.
So that's cool. Yeah. So how then did you kind of find your way into this interest in the shadow and kind of diving deep into the shadow work stuff?
The shadow is a concept that I was introduced to a few years ago. And when I was introduced to it, I realized like, oh, well, I already know what that is. I've known what it is for a long time. I've always been interested in it, but I just never had it articulated as the shadow. But now that I've heard it, I'm like, that's good. That's a good concept. It's simple. It's accessible. People know what you mean when you phrase it that way. And so I just kind of latched onto it and was like, this is important. This concept, the shadow, people need to understand this. And I became very interested in how do you explain it? How do you articulate it? What are all the examples of the shadow and all these different levels, all these different fractals of human existence? It's like there is a personal shadow, there's a collective shadow, there's a societal shadow, there's even a shadow, you might say, in like nature, inanimate shadow, like metaphysical shadow. It depends how abstract you want to get, but it's really a powerful idea, and it's very useful, I think, as far as doing self-work. If you can understand this concept of the shadow, it's really key to everything that you might consider to be spiritual, everything that is self-empowering, everything that is like, how do I become a better person? How do I do better in life? How do I become wise? How do I heal? All of that, it's like shadow work. Like you can explain it with the shadow in some way. And so I just think it's a really beautiful image, concept, symbol. And that's why I kind of latched onto it.
Yeah, it's interesting as you're saying this, and as I've been looking more carefully into it, it's really a kind of frame for looking at things. And I'm really starting to realize how universal it is, because as I was just kind of researching and putting notes, you know, I'm a meditator, and there's kind of a way of looking at meditation where it's not that shadow work is a subset of meditation. You can really look at meditation as really just being about shadow work, being about turning towards things that are hidden.
Yeah.
So it can be pretty inclusive, but I guess before we dive in a little bit too much, you've kind of defined it a little bit and described it a little bit as you've described your entry into it, but it might be good for you to like kind of more directly kind of explain what the shadow is.
Yeah. So the shadow is a term that was coined by Carl Jung. And I think that he focused on it as a really important aspect of his work. Other people have kind of ran with that a little bit, I think. The way that I interpret the shadow is pretty broad. I really like using a sort of broad definition. And from that, you can kind of hone in on like more specific definitions. But the shadow, in the most abstract, broad way, the shadow is something that is part of a system that isn't integrated into the system. That's abstract, right? That's pretty broad. But you can see that, you can apply that to all kinds of things. But if we get more specific, if we say on the personal level, for me, let's say as an individual, the shadow would be the unknown side of myself. or the me I cannot see is something thrown around at Rebel Wisdom. I really like that saying a lot because it's so simple. The me good, I cannot see, right? And so like, what does that mean? The me I cannot see. Everyone, I don't care who you are, there's a lot about you as an individual that you don't understand about yourself, that you don't notice, that you're not picking up on. And it could be something that everyone else sees that you don't. You might actually be someone who's kind of abrasive in the way they talk, or seems unfriendly, or comes off as being kind of like an asshole sometimes, but you don't actually realize that. You don't see that. Because you have this subjective perspective. You can't see it from the outside and watch yourself and be like, oh, that's what I look like. That's what I sound like. So that idea that there's actually part of me that I don't see, that I don't know, that's the shadow. But it could also, it could be part of you that you don't see. It could be part of you that you haven't explored yet, right? Like children have this process as they become adults of learning who they are. And that's another way of thinking of it, is like, you don't know who you are yet. And life is a process of becoming who you are. And that part of you that you haven't become yet, that you don't know yet, that's the shadow. It's potential for you to become, potential for you to discover yourself. By the time we reach 30, a lot of us have uncovered a lot of who we actually are. The shadow has been, you've cast light on this unknown side of yourself, and you've become who you're meant to be. The unknown has become known. You could also think of it as trauma or suppression. There's an unknown side of the self because you've actively suppressed it. Maybe you had such a terrible childhood that you have actively compartmentalized these experiences and tucked them away somewhere inside you. And so there's an unknown side of you that is just it's a product of injury. Let's say you're traumatized, you're out of touch with who you are because you're traumatized. That's another way of thinking of the shadow. Shadow work involves healing. Maybe you're broken, maybe you're injured, something's happened to you. Shadow work could be taking that darkness that's inside of you and bringing it back out up into the surface where you can integrate it. So that's probably the most common way that we deal with the term shadow, is on that personal level.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's kind of interesting you say by the time we're 30, usually things have been kind of revealed. Maybe that's kind of like the pattern for more healthy people. I felt like the 30s was like my zenith of like covering up, concealing things for me. Until kind of that it broke. I mean, maybe that's just my pattern, I
think it's a good point that, there's not just this linear progression of like, self-discovery where like you figure out who you are. It's like a lot of the times we don't, and we get further and further into darkness. We hit rock bottom. Some people say that, we get trapped into a kind of life situation where we can't really be ourselves. And that involves a lot of covering up. And, so I agree with you. I mean, the 30s so far for me have been really rocky. And I feel like in many ways, the more questions I ask in my 30s, the more I don't know, the more I get confused, the more I feel like, what is going on in the world? Like, I don't know. Like, I thought I knew, and now I don't. And who am I? Like, I thought I knew, but now I don't. So it definitely is not this linear process.
Sure. Yeah. The other thing I think is interesting is the kind of immediate instinct I think I had when I first started thinking about the shadow, and I think most people have, is like, it's these secret, ugly things that we don't want to see. That normally it's kind of the monsters we don't want to see. Yeah. But there is also kind of this idea that the unseen can also be like beautiful things too. I mean, maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Right. So in many ways, the shadow could be thought of the ugly side of ourselves, or the undesirable side, the things that we don't want to be true about who we are, which is why we suppress them. We say, no, that's not me. Like I am not this weak little boy. I'm a man. I'm a strong man now. But the thing is, like, the little boy is in there somewhere. And so we kind of might say, well, like, weakness is ugly. I don't want to be weak. So we can deny it, suppress it, and say, the little boy doesn't exist, when actually the little boy is in there like saying, help me, like give me some attention, let me out. So that's one side of it, right? The kind of the ugliness of self that we suppress because we don't want to be that thing. But there is also this idea of the golden shadow, right? And that's where we derive the name of the podcast, is that the shadow is dark and it can be ugly. It can even be bad in some sense. But one way of thinking of the golden shadow is that ugliness can be acknowledged, it can be engaged, and then that darkness can be turned into potential, right? The more that you work with your shadow, the more whole you become. So the shadow is actually this gold mine. Like, do you want to become better? Do you want to improve yourself? Do you want to figure out your life? There's this huge gold mine of material that's deep in your unconscious. And if you can dig into it, you can actually take it out and become more complete. So that's like one idea of the golden shadow. But there's also what you were saying. There's stuff that we suppress that's actually positive stuff. It's beautiful stuff. We might say, I am weak. Instead of saying like, I'm a strong man and suppressing the little boy, we could do the opposite and say that like, I'm not a man. I'm weak. I'm a little boy. I don't know what I'm doing. No one will ever love me. In many ways, we are suppressing the whole, complete, beautiful man that's actually in there that wants to come out. And so the shadow isn't just evil, bad stuff. It's also can be beautiful, good stuff. It can be a lot of potential, what you could become. If you would just have the courage and the resilience to dive into that darkness and swim in those waters and bring that stuff back to light.
Yeah, that's good. And I think that kind of brings us to, we could talk more about like the shadow, and we can get to this maybe at some point, but like the shadow in relationships and in societies and all this stuff, which is really interesting. I think it'd be interesting to talk about some of the shadow work. And I want to kind of relay my experience doing the shadow work stuff, this Rebel Wisdom course. I just had a ton of fun doing it. And it was definitely like one of probably my top favorite session that we did was the shadow work one, because awesome. There are other things that were kind of generative, but it's a lot of fun. And that's because it was this very archetypal thing, kind of summoning these beings that represent your different shadow sides. And actually, I want to show you, I did a little drawing of my shadow character. And then for people listening on the podcast, there'll be a link for this in the descriptions.
Yeah, for the listeners, this course, this live player course, was a series of sessions. Alyssa and I did one session that was on the shadow, and there were a few exercises, but the main exercise at the end was that we're going to try and take some of this shadow material that we sort of generated in the previous exercise, and we're going to personify it. We're going to anthropomorphize the shadow into a being of some kind. And that could be a person, like a villain, or it could be like a monster or a creature or something even more abstract than that, like a weird dark cloud of energy, anything that comes up. And the idea is that when you do this, when you summon up this character, and you can summon up lots of characters, you could have a pantheon of shadow figures, which is something we kind of alluded to at the end. But when you summon up this figure, you can actually sort of dialogue with the figure. You can kind of be like, who are you? Like, what do you want? What are you doing here? And we find that this kind of person-to-person interaction, even though the thing is imaginary, generates all this interesting information, brings up all these feelings that you didn't know were there. Like if you ask this being, let's say what you generated was some kind of like dragon, let's say. You could be like, what do you want? Like, dragon, like, why are you here? And the dragon might say like, no one believes in me anymore, or something like that. Like no one pays attention to me. No one sees how grand and beautiful I am as a dragon. And, interesting things can come up like that. And you have to be like, okay, what part of me is saying that? And you can kind of pursue that. And anyways, that was the exercise. So
yeah, and part of what was really fun is you do this kind of 3-2-1 thing, which is really interesting, where you observe the thing from the outside, then you speak to it directly, like second person, and then you become the thing and speak as the thing.
Right.
And so I thought that was pretty cool.
Right. The idea behind the 3-2-1 thing is that the process in which we disown our shadow, which we say, this is not me, progresses in this way, which is like, first person is we own it. I am the shadow. Second person is we project it onto someone else. Like my girlfriend is the shadow. She is the source of like all my troubles, you're projecting. And then third person is almost like, it's just something out there that I don't even interact with. And so the idea of the 3-2-1 is to reverse those steps in order to re-own the shadow, integrate it back into yourself.
Yeah. So I went through the exercise and it was pretty interesting. Like things came up like very, very quickly for me. And this thing that first came up for me was just like this, that I called the creature Calawax, the Reaver. And it was just this completely like cruel, lustful, like horrible thing. It was like so like cliche, like shadow. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like part of myself,
Yeah.
But what was really cool going through the process as I was kind of doing this 3-2-1 thing, going from the outside, I'm talking with it and it's just very mean and wants to consume, wants to destroy, wants to cause pain. And the more I went through the process, the more I saw this kind of process happening of transmutation, where the kind of thing kind of changed as the energy dissipated. I was like, oh, kind of once it kind of has a voice, it kind of transformed into something else, became this very expansive, energetic, like beautiful thing. And I haven't made a picture of what that would look like.
Yeah.
But it was pretty cool to see that. It's like seeing like repression happening in like and unfolding within a few seconds, so it was, or not, within a few minutes. So,
well, that's great to hear. The fact that it worked for you is awesome. And it makes me really happy to hear that from people. And I'm looking at the thing you drew, and it's amazing. And this ugly alien monster with all these limbs, it's kind of spidery, but it's also kind of like dragon like. And I feel like it looks like it has like 8 penises, maybe, just like.
Yeah, there's definitely some sort of like sexual thing going on there. So, So
that's so interesting. And it seems like the exercise is really successful. And just generating that is already useful. It's like, what the fuck is that? What does it mean?
Yeah.
So it's awesome that it worked for you.
Yeah. And then you kind of get into this thing about like creating a pantheon, which I thought was really interesting. And you showed some of your pantheon. Yeah. Which was a lot of fun. I mean, you had like 2 images from Akira, which was like a good sign that the right things are bouncing around in your psyche.
you would notice that. You would notice that. Not everyone would catch that, but you did, of course. Yeah, the Pantheon. So to expand on this idea of taking shadow content and personifying it into a being of some kind, we're made up, this is kind of cliche, but like we can think of ourselves as being made up of like sub personalities. We do have versions of ourselves that come out at different times. And, we're trying to be what we view as the best version of ourselves. We aim for that. But the reality is that like sometimes we're this weird, ugly version of ourselves, or we're a very trickstery, silly version of ourselves, or we're the child version of ourselves, or maybe we're in a bad relationship that causes us to become angry and maybe even sort of violent in some way. And it's like, who is that thing I'm becoming in this weird situation? Like, that's not me. That's not who I want to be, but it is you, right? So the idea is that the Pantheon is you can personify your shadow into all these different characters that kind of, as a collective, map out your psyche, right? And that's that, because the theory is, my theory at least, is like the Greek pantheon, for instance. You have Zeus, you have Hera, you have Hermes, Aphrodite. It's like the idea is that the Greek pantheon is actually 12 sub-personalities that kind of map out the human experience. Each of us has like a father kind of figure. Like Zeus Each of us has like a mother figure like Hera. Each of us has a kind of trickster, like fluid shapeshifter kind of personality, which is Hermes. Each of us has this kind of mating, sexual kind of hot version of ourselves, maybe Aphrodite. And so we can find ourselves at any time in the Pantheon. And with the personal Pantheon, we're sort of creating that is like, there's the God version of me, the best version of me, the all powerful, all seeing version of me. There's like the demon version of me that like, it's buried in there, but it comes out and it just wants to like wreak vengeance on people. And there's the child version of me, like the little boy Arran, like he's in there too. And, if you do this, you can come up with like a cast of characters and maybe you have like 6 or 7, like I have like 6 or 7, I think. And you can dialogue with them and you can say, hey, little boy Arran, like, are you okay? Like, what do you need? And he's like, well, I just need a hug. And it's like, okay, that's interesting. Like maybe I can like kind of like try to like self-soothe in some way. Or maybe there's the anima version of me, like the female version of me. What do you need? And it's like, well, I feel like I need more room to breathe because like the masculine side is like overpowering and just wants to be in control over the time. Like, let me be more sensitive. Let me be more feeling. Let me breathe more. So you can have these dialogues with the characters. You can even have them interact with each other. You can have the little boy talk to the demon and be like, hey, demon, what's going on? And the demon's like, little boy, like, what are you doing here? And interesting stuff comes out of this. And I think an even more interesting thing to do with the personal Pantheon is to do things like write stories, like using the characters. And you could find, and you especially, because you're a comic book artist, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, your comics must be autobiographical in some way.
Oh yeah. That's one thing I was going to bring up. We're talking a little bit about this before we started about art as kind of like a pathway to the shadow. And that's always what happens whenever I'm telling a story is it's just they become these clearly autobiographical things to me. And they're saying these things about me I totally didn't intend in some ways that are kind of like embarrassing. We're like, oh, this is so obviously the story of this, and this is my relationship with my dad, and these types of things.
Exactly.
But I've got this character. So the main character of the last comic I published is basically this monk character. And so he's definitely this archetype of like my like sacred self, the best intentions, maybe kind of naive in some ways. But you see those things, but also he's a character that has a destructive side too, which is kind of interesting. Uh-huh. But yeah, I think this is very interesting. And it's kind of, you can almost kind of go both directions. You can discover this Pantheon through storytelling, or you can kind of create a Pantheon and do storytelling with that. And I guess the way that you actually kind of create the Pantheon is you just kind of go through that exercise multiple times, right? You just kind of like do this exercise, see who is summoned. And then you kind of like, have you had the experience of kind of doing this exercise and having characters that are kind of like, oh, these are kind of the same character. Like these guys can kind of like merge together, or
absolutely.
What has that been like for you?
Yeah. So it's always, all this stuff is a process, right? I mean, it's, you gotta turn it into a practice. Every spiritual thing that you do, everything that you might consider to be self work or shadow work is not a one-time deal where you just do it and you're done, right? It's a process. It has to become a practice. So the Pantheon, if you're gonna personify yourself into sub-personalities, into characters, this is a process that takes time, right? And as you do it, you're gonna refine the characters. You're gonna make them more and more true to that side of you. And you will find that, like, if you're playing this game or doing this exercise of kind of like trying to just sort of conjure up, just let it emerge a character inside of you, you might find that you're like kind of like doing some overlap. Like, oh, those two are the same character. Like I have like a demon character, and then I was kind of doing a sort of meditative exercise, and I came up with like this like gross monster, like this garbage monster being, and it's kind of like, well, they're kind of the same character. Or maybe you keep them distinct and you zoom in further on each one and refine them and say, you know what, there's actually something different going on here. Like the garbage monster is kind of like about hedonism, like junk food, oversleeping, jerking off too much, whatever, something like that. Whereas like the demon character is actually kind of more like vengeful. Like the demon character actually wants to like destroy things. And it's like, they're kind of two different characters. So like, I'll explore each of them, So it's never perfect. Obviously you can't just be like, oh, well, I've finished. I've come up with the perfect pantheon. All the characters are exactly who they're meant to be. Like, no, it's like, it's much more nebulous, hazy than that. And you kind of just got to work with what you got and figure it out. But just the process of working it out, the process of refining these characters just generates so much interesting material. And that's what it's about. It's the process as far as, rather than the product, you might say.
Yeah, that's really interesting that there's kind of the trend. There can be a trend of condensing or of like parsing things apart. And the two things that came to mind is there's like Stephen King. Like Stephen King's kind of done this thing where he has all his books and over time he's kind of like, yeah, these are actually the same character. These three characters are actually the same character in a different guise, But then on the other side, I was thinking about Sin City, Frank Miller's Sin City, and how it's really, it's three iterations of the same archetype. There are these three there's always tough guys.
Yeah.
But then there's all these nuances of like, what type of tough guy are each of these, Yeah. And so it's kind of fun. I mean, and it really just depends on like what your needs are, what sort of problems you need to solve as far as like, do you need to parse those things apart? I mean, I'm sure certain probably for men nowadays, that's a very tricky process and very delicate process of like, what is a masculine archetype right now? And how am I going to like split that apart from other things I've been given that aren't functional?
Yeah. Definitely. World, And, I mean, just the idea that like the same archetypes keep coming up in stories, for instance, like Stephen King has all these books and he's written so many fucking books that it's like, you have to start repeating yourself eventually.
There's going to be some overlap there.
Yeah. It's like, you can't just keep generating like, it's like completely new and original again. It's like, no, I mean, after you've written like dozens of books, it's like, there's gotta be some like borrowing from the last book. But even like these archetypes that are inside of us are also the archetypes that are in myth and in story and in our modern myths, our modern, the movies, TV shows, comic books, video games. Those characters, they're kind of all the same, right? And that's why the idea of the Pantheon is sort of this universal idea. Is like the Greek Pantheon, we all have it inside us. And that's why if you look at Lord of the Rings, Frodo, he's kind of the same as Luke Skywalker, and and they're kind of the same as Harry Potter, and they're kind of the same as Neo from the Matrix, and they're kind of the same as like Jon Stark from Game of Thrones. It's like these stories are universal. The nuances are different. Jon Snow is, kind of a better sword fighter than Frodo, right? But like there's like the hero archetype. And just like we all have the hero archetype in us, the green monk for your story is a hero. It's whatever you envision as, kind of like a good man probably, or a man who has troubles, but he's brave and he does his best to kind of overcome his troubles. Like we all have that inside of us. We all have some sort of villain kind of thing inside of us, like Sauron or Voldemort or Darth Vader, whatever. It's all overlapping a whole bunch. So part of the process of refining these things, this Pantheon, is just you're discovering those same archetypes, but we all have varied relationships with those archetypes. You might have a bad relationship with the hero for some reason. Maybe you're not courageous. Maybe you don't behave bravely and you don't do what needs to be done. You're not very responsible. You have a bad relationship with the hero archetype. Or someone else might have a good relationship with it, but you both have the hero archetype, right? So that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, that's nice. I think so much of this stuff like kind of goes examined too. Obviously, like art plays such a large part in our culture.
Yeah.
But if we were just stop to say like, why do I watch the things I do? Why do I read the things I do? Think about how that's a reflection of ourselves.
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting. Kind of that examination of things helps you to start having like a good relationship to those things,
Absolutely.
As far as like, I have this archetype, like, what's my relationship? Is this thing that's just out here that I'm never going to touch this thing I want to be, you know, or denying this other stuff that's maybe dragging us down, I guess.
Absolutely.
So yeah. The other thing that I thought would be interesting to kind of talk about was, that I think it's really good that you've brought up, is kind of the dangers of shadow work.
Yeah.
And on your discussion on the Stoa, you had this great image of like this figure in bright light and someone like kind of not being able to, like, you know, being kind of blown away by the light, you know, sun is too bright type of thing.
Right.
And I actually thought of like an archetype for this that I kind of like, is like the archetype of like the mad scientist. And this is kind of like one of the problems of our day, is like, with our brilliance, we're going to create one little elixir that we can drink, and that's going to give us superpowers. And, you know, that always turns into like, you know, mad scientist turns into a monster. Obviously there are like superhero versions of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, you talk about like psychedelics. I think it's definitely true with meditation.
Yeah.
Maybe you can talk just a little bit about that, and just kind of like the dangers of kind of jumping in too fast into this stuff.
Right. So the shadow is something that we want to integrate. Hopefully it would be good to integrate the shadow, no matter what situation, what form that shadow takes. And by shadow integration, we mean that, like, you take that unseen, unexplored, that thing that isn't part of the system, and you try to bring it back into the system and get it back in working order. So there's a lot of ways you can think about this, but, you know, if you are traumatized, there's part of you that isn't working properly, or it's not working for you anymore. It's actually working against you. And so if you had such a bad childhood experience that you're afraid to get close to anyone now, you can't be intimate with people, part of you is working against you, right? And so the idea of shadow work, if you were going to successfully do shadow work, you would do something that brings that part of you back into the fold. You heal it, you kind of engage with it, and you say, come back to the light, right? You kind of like shine a light on it and you bring it back in. And so that kind of like trauma work through therapy, for instance, would bring that broken side of you that's afraid to be intimate back into working order. And now you can be intimate again, right? So that's like a basic idea. That's shadow integration. But the thing is that shadow integration involves a gradual sort of incremental process. You have to do it slowly, because if you try to integrate shadow instantaneously, let's say, it doesn't work. It's actually counterproductive. It's destructive. And, you know, one way to think about this is, if someone has had a traumatized past, if you force them somehow, let's say, to confront their trauma, if you say, okay, we're going to go through all these traumatic memories right now for the next 6 hours, let's talk about it. Okay, so like, tell me about your dad beating you now, relive it. Like, let's go through it. It's like the response to that for someone is they relive the trauma, and it only forces them to suppress it even further. They'll just say, no, like, no, I'm not doing this. They'll freak out. They'll have a panic attack, and they'll be even less likely to approach it in the future. So you've made things worse, right? Your attempt to integrate the shadow has actually forced the shadow further bit down. Another example of this on a interpersonal level, right? If you have a relationship with someone and there's something about your relationship that you guys aren't talking about, there's something going on that, like, we're not communicating about, that's a shadow, right? It's unspoken. It's going on, but we're not talking about it. You can try to integrate it by saying, like, hey, let's have a conversation. I feel like you've been treating me poorly. Like, you've been treating me like I'm not your friend anymore for some reason. Can we talk about it? If you can do that in a gentle, sort of gradual way, you can actually heal, right? And you can say, well, man, like, I'm upset because, you started dating my girlfriend, and it had only been 6 months after we started dating. And, like, dude, like, that's messed up. And, like, we never talked about it, but I was really upset about it. You can work it out. And then they'll be like, okay, you know what? I never meant to hurt you. I love you, man. Like, I love you too. And you become friends. But at the same time, you could try to integrate that shadow too quickly, and you could confront someone and be like, why are you treating me poorly? Like, what's the deal, dude? And you could be so aggressive about trying to like integrate that shadow that the person actually says like, whoa, 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 like leave me alone. Like, don't force me into this uncomfortable conversation. Like, I don't appreciate that. And you could keep forcing it until the person stops talking to you completely. And then like the shadow has just grown, you know? So an attempt to integrate the shadow too hard, too quick is actually destructive. It's counterproductive. Another example, you know, taking drugs, you already brought up psychedelics. If you do a bunch of acid, all this interesting stuff can come up that you're not confronting. Like, oh my God, I realized that like I hate my job and I got to pursue my passion. And like, I couldn't accept that until now. The shadow came up and I see it and I've integrated it. And I know that like I need to pursue my art. I can't work in the office anymore. So you've integrated that shadow in some way. But at the same time, you could do a bunch of acid and you could have a really, really bad trip. And you could just be like, oh my God, like, what the fuck am I doing with my life? And like, I'm freaked out. I'm so freaked out about my existence. Like, oh God, like I can't quit my job. What am I going to do for money? Like, you know, and you could bring up all this dark material that actually freaks you out so much that it just makes you not want to ever do it again. Like, I'm never going to that dark place again. And it makes things worse. So those are some examples.
Yeah. And I mean, those things can get really dangerous. I mean, there have been stories of people like really losing their minds. And I know of at least one story of like some young woman that like, by all accounts was a totally happy person, did some like 10-day intensive Goenka retreat and like came back totally dissociated and ended up committing suicide. So it's like, the threats are like, there's like, it is like serious stuff. Yeah. And I've kind of found for myself, like I've kind of overdone it quite a bit in my own life. And part of why that is you do a little bit of exploration and it like bears some fruit. You're like, oh, this is really cool. So you're like, let's dive in head first. This is cool. Let's do it, you know? Yeah. And then suddenly it can be really easy to like be overloaded, but also then you get excited and you're like telling your other friends and there's like peer pressure and like, oh, you got to go do this. You need to try this. And, I had this experience. It's very similar to the one you gave of interpersonal stuff, like doing therapy with my wife, where we, you know, started doing therapy. I got very excited about it. And I was always like, we got to practice this stuff when we're not at therapy. And I was bugging her and she's just like, leave me alone, you know? Yeah. And it's interesting that I've noticed I was so pushy to do that, but just over time, naturally, that stuff has like evolved and opened up. So, yeah, maybe that's just like our modern Western mindset is we just want to like rev the engine, you know, when something's working and some of the stuff just needs to unfold naturally. Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's the unfortunate truth that we don't want to admit to ourselves is that like the real work is a grind. You know, people get so excited about spirituality and they discover meditation or they discover yoga or they discover psychedelics and they kind of get into their heads like, oh, I can just like fix myself in a month. I'm just going to like, just like do it. And so they start, you know, maybe they're like, do ayahuasca and it's like, oh, I finally understand everything now. I'm good. I'm healed. And it's kind of like a hubris of thinking that the spiritual path can be one that's like fun and it's always a good time. And, you know, you kind of just do it. And then you're like, you're enlightened. Like I'm enlightened, everyone. When the reality is that like, it's to do the real work. It's not going to feel good all the time. You're going to have to do it when you don't want to do it. It's going to feel like work, meaning like, I got to do it every day. I got to show up and do this thing. And I really don't want to. I'd rather just like sleep in or watch TV. And that's the unfortunate truth about all these things. And shadow work, especially, is that like it needs to be incremental. It has to be done on a regular basis every day, or, you know, maybe like once a week, if that's all you can handle. And it's years and years and years and years to get to a better place. And if you don't have the patience for that, you're not going to change. Like nothing's going to happen. And we don't want to accept that. We don't want to accept that it actually takes work.
Yeah, I think what's common thing that people have in their mind is like, I'm going to do some sort of psychedelic trip. And it's like, okay, I accept that it could like be horrible. I accept I could like go through some sort of crazy experiences. But if I go through that, it's going to be smooth sailing after that. I'll have everything like kind of figured out. And the truth is sometimes that gets you stuck even more, where you start on some path where you're like, oh shit, I have to deal with this thing that I've suddenly realized. And it's going to be a long process.
Yeah. I mean, someone that I was very close to, they started kind of going to therapy, and they started doing meditation, and they started kind of intentionally trying to go to this place of like, like they felt that there was some trauma inside of them, and they kind of like had this idea of like, I could go there and I could bring it up and I could start engaging with this stuff and I could heal. And when they did this, they over time started getting more and more anxious, and they started becoming more and more kind of like flighty and nervous and wanting to kind of be alone a lot. And then they started having panic attacks, and they had never had panic attacks before. But bringing up this traumatic material, like it's suppressed, and it's suppressed for a reason. That doesn't mean you should leave it alone. But like the idea is like, if you bring it up, like it's going to be serious, and it can do serious things to you. And so this person just started regularly having panic attacks of just like getting this place where they suddenly have this like anxiety feedback loop, and they freak out, and they have to like go, cower in a corner and just like, and that had never happened before. And that was just as a result of trying to engage with this material, this traumatic past, this darkness inside of them. And it's like, that needs to be understood, is that it's going to get worse before it gets better, usually in the situations. And it could be something that is so embodied and unconscious that if you bring it up, you might not be able to do anything like outthink it, like think happy thoughts. Like your body might just kind of like have to deal with it. And that can happen. So there's a danger with shadow work. You need to be secure in some ways. Your life needs to be secure enough for you to handle some of this dark material coming up. And if you're not ready for it, if you're not resilient enough, and if your life isn't in order, you might bring this stuff up and it could just wreck your life. So it's something that you got to keep in mind.
Yeah. I think, obviously mindfulness has been a very like popular thing, and, therapy, and there's other things, there's all these ways we have to reveal what's hidden, but shadow work isn't just about revealing this stuff. It's like you said, it's revealing it and integrating it. Yeah. And sometimes that integrating process can take a long time, and that can be definitely be painful. So, I want to zoom out a little bit now.
Sure.
There was some stuff I caught in your discussion at the Stoa about shadow sensemaking, that I liked, because it was very speculative, but it was kind of fun in that way. But also, you were like coming to a lot of the same conclusions I've been coming to. So I thought that was kind of, I always get excited anytime I'm like, okay, he's kind of thinking some of the same things.
Okay.
But you're kind of talking about, like sense making on the internet, or doing sense, shadow work, like online, and kind of the problems of doing shadow work online. And so I thought it'd be interesting to cover that. And you could just talk about like some of the limitations you see of what can we do online, and what can't we do online? And then maybe we can talk about this idea of what you call shadow study hall, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah. So again, these are just ideas, and I've talked to other people about that talk I gave, and I've had people sort of express they think I'm being too conservative or too cautious about these ideas. And like, maybe I'm being too cautious, but I think caution is important. As we just discussed, it's like, you got to be careful with this stuff. But so we find ourselves here on the internet. You and I are interacting on the internet. We don't know each other. We've never met before. Probably won't ever meet in real life, but here we are, right? This is what's going on, especially after 2020. This is what's going on more and more. People are meeting on the internet. They're having meaningful discussions. They're forming meaningful connections somewhat. And the question comes up of, how much healing can be done over the internet with these people, or how much real community can be built where you begin to develop meaningful relationships trusting relationships with people that you will never meet in real life, right? That's the question that's coming up. And of course, this has been true always on the internet, is like weird internet friends. Like, what is it? What does it mean? You know, I'll start off with saying that there's a huge amount of potential here. Like, it's very exciting. Like, what could happen as a result of our ability to connect to people who live across the globe? Like, I have friends in Australia now. You know, it's around the world, but they're cool, and we connect personality-wise, I think, more so than most people I see in real life. It's like, that's powerful. You can meet people who are like you, and you won't feel so alone, and you can explore the things you want to explore. And on top of that, you know, places like Rebel Wisdom, and I'd say even more so the Stoa, because I'm more of a Stoa guy than a Rebel Wisdom guy. But, you know, not that I have anything against Rebel Wisdom, I think that Peter is doing something that I think is kind of more interesting for me, at least. But there's the opportunity for completely digital wisdom communities or academies that are popping up. They're kind of like DIY educational philosophical spaces where people can come from around the world to learn, and they can learn for free, and they can help each other understand the world better. They can help each other become more wise. We can develop practices together. And that's really powerful, right? The idea that, like, having a hub that's digital that everyone around the world can find, they can see the beacon of, like, you know, John Vervaeke is giving a talk at this place called the Stoa, and like all these people around the world will come and find it. And the ability for a collective to come together and generate these interesting ideas, innovations in shadow work even, but like philosophical ideas, making sense of the world. The world's very confusing right now. Our ability to sense make together is really going to enhance how much we can understand what's going on, and have a lot of different perspectives that we can trust, hopefully, enlightening us about like what's going on in the world. How do we prepare for what's happening, et cetera? How do we learn what to do? So there's a lot of potential there, right? Now, the cautious part, I would say, is that these people are not embodied, right? We're on the internet, but we're just information traveling to other places. I'm seeing your face, but you're just information. I'm just information. So what are we really? It's like we're just sort of egos on the internet talking. We're not embodied. And because of that, weird things happen. Like, I can conceal who I am entirely. You don't really know who I am. This could all be a facade. I could just be manipulating you. I could just be putting on a happy face and being like, I'm totally functional and smart. And then when I got off the internet, my life is a wreck. You'll never know. And so that's what's tough. You find that if you, like, for instance, if you live with someone, the shadow is going to come out. You're going to see who they really are. You're going to understand all their bullshit. You're going to see all the mess that they make in their lives. They can pretend to be fully functional, but you're going to see that, in fact, they're not fully functional, because no one is. And that happens because our lives are actually present together. And on the internet, that's not the case. So it makes it very difficult to do real work because people don't voluntarily reveal who they really are on the internet. And that's tough. And I mean, beyond that, we all have like screen names. Some people are just using avatars. You've gone so far away from who you really are that how can you get to know someone who's just an avatar? You can't really, you know? So
in some ways it's kind of like there's this trend that's come up where now IRL has become a qualifier. You say this IRL, and it's like now real life is becoming, talking about shadows, it's becoming the shadow of the internet is real life. Right. Which that's a huge fucking shadow if you're going to start putting, real life out of your awareness. But yeah, this is something that really resonates with me, is just this idea that a key part of the puzzle is having, and it's not to downplay the internet. Like I've had more of hope in what the internet can actually become lately than I have since early days of the internet.
Yeah.
But you have to have these nodes where people are like trying this stuff out, you know, in the same spaces. I really like this idea of embodied cognition, and I have a meditation teacher that studies this stuff. And one point she makes about it is embodiment isn't just about it is the body, but it's also everything we experience and how much that's part of our cognition.
Yeah.
We're missing that with the internet. You know, the idea of being in the same space with other people. There's a type of intelligence when you share a space. I've had this experience of kind of learning circling over the last few months. For the first time, I've done a few circling sessions. Yeah. I'm like, wow, this is so cool. And it's all with people online. Like, this stuff is so cool, you know? And everyone's always like, I wish we were in the same room together. I wish we could all, like, you know, be sitting around in a circle.
Yeah.
And it seems like that just needs to be part of like the feedback loop, like real life nodes uploading to the internet, and then like the best practices, and then you like disseminate that back out to the nodes, you know, just like this positive feedback loop of internet to real life, you know?
Exactly. So that's the important point here, I think, is the idea of, so you mentioned shadow study hall, and the point is, excuse me, like study hall, let's say like a college study hall, what is it? It's like, it's a bunch of people who are going to study together, but they're not necessarily committed to working on all the same projects or all committed to one project at the same time. It's not even as if they're like a community. They're just people who've come together to learn. And then after it's over, they leave and go back to their respective lives. And so that is a good way to think about what the internet can do, and a good way to think about the Stoa, for instance, or any sort of wisdom community on the internet, is like, there's an amazing opportunity for people to come around from all over and learn together and teach each other things. But ultimately, our lives need to be maintained and understood as existing IRL in real life. I mean, like, it seems like a no-brainer, like, obviously, right? But like, you know, there's never going to be a real community in the sense that I would define a community on the internet. Like, it's never going to happen. You have to have an embodied in-person community. That needs to be your priority. But in the meantime, you can go to the Stoa or someplace else, and you can learn about circling, for instance. You can learn this collective meditation practice, and you can actually learn it. Even though you're not present with other people, there's still all this good information that you can take in, and then you can take it back to your in-person community and teach them things. And, you know, that needs to be, they both need to be happening. So people who exist entirely on the internet, they have no social life outside of it. It's incredibly unhealthy. It's never going to turn into what you want it to be. It's never going to become something where you have real friends, I would say. And anyone listening who is really into the internet, like, I'm not judging. I don't want you to like feel like I'm like saying you have no life, but I think it's true. It's like, what's healthy is your in-person community, your local community. Get involved in that, meet real people, have real relationships, and try to become better people together. But the internet is an amazing tool to learn things, and you can go and meet other people on the internet who are also wanting to learn things, and you can collectively just teach each other so much. And that's what's so useful and so powerful. And you can form a network that even like you have these in-person nodes, like you said, these in-person communities, but they're connected to all these other in-person communities. And you can do things like, hey, we're all going to Burning Man, you know, and you can actually all get together and be embodied because of this online network. And then after it's over, you go back to your local communities. And that's what I see as being the kind of healthy possibility of this scene, this sense-making scene, is the ability to do that.
Yeah. And that seems like really the next step. That's kind of cool to see, like things like the Monastic Academy, what they're doing, where they're definitely taking all this stuff that definitely has come from being connected to the internet, testing it out in real life. And then I'm taking a course with them right now. So then they're like disseminating it out, and it's just kind of like, what type of feedback loop do we want? Do we want a feedback loop where like, like the internet's making our life shittier, and then we're like bringing that shit back to the internet, which is kind of like how it is right now, you know?
It is. You can tell me about your story. I'm actually like really curious as like what has brought you to start this podcast, and what brought you to the Rebel Wisdom scene. what are you interested in developing? What do you want to build here or build in your life?
Yeah.
What's your story?
Sure. Yeah. Well, this is kind of interesting because, Arran, this might be my last episode of my podcast, actually, to tell you the truth. So it's
wow. Okay. I'm the closer.
Good one to close on. Yeah. So for me, I mean, I could go into my life story, but just to keep it brief, like I kind of, had a midlife crisis. I ended up, kind of finding meditation, and I had kind of this big unexpected like meditation experience that just transformed my way of looking at things. And so that sent me on this course of like, okay, I had this amazing experience. It was beautiful, but it doesn't make any sense to me, And so that sent me on this process of like trying to figure out, a kind of a new way to look at life and to frame life, and a new way of thinking about spirituality. I discovered stuff like pragmatic Dharma. That was kind of the first thing I stumbled onto, like mastering core teachings of the Buddha. Actually had a chance to talk to Daniel Ingram, but, like I was an artist, and kind of this whole process just made me really start questioning why I was making art. Should I be making art? Like I had part of my experience was like, I call myself an artist, but like, I don't have to be an artist. I don't have to identify as an artist. Like, why is that who I am? And that's something that I just put on myself for so many years. And so this podcast has really been this project of trying to understand what being an artist means to me, or trying to rediscover that.
Yeah.
And some of that's been like the actual process of making art within this specific realm of comics. And part of it has been like, this very personal, really going inward and trying to understand, myself. And I think, that's the place you have to start with sense making, and the place you have to start if you want to have a positive influence on the world is like, you really have to look inwards. But then a lot of it has been exploring all these different facets that can affect that. And, part of it has been like meditation. Part of it has been urbanism. Like that's one area I'm really interested in. You talk about like embodied intelligence. I've really kind of discovered, or I'm really just in this idea of even our like places, cities, streets, buildings, how everything relates, this kind of intelligence being embodied in those things, and how that affects, our potential.
Yeah.
But I mean, kind of the cool thing after doing this process, I really stopped making art while I was making this podcast.
Yeah.
And, like the stuff I was sharing with you, like this like monster, this is like some of the first stuff I'm doing now at kind of the termination of this, and kind of just like finding a love again for art, and finding a purpose in making art, but it's kind of like a renewed purpose.
Yeah.
It's, one of these things where you like go on this journey and you kind of end up back in the same place you started, but it's different, once you
Absolutely.
make that journey. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's so much need for art. And, I think in these online spaces, like we said, like they're emerging, they're kind of new. Like, what are they? What is this going to be? What's the potential here? But it needs art. It needs creativity. It can be very sterile in how much it's just conversation, right? People talk and they talk and they talk, and there's ideas and ideas and theory, and people are talking about this theory of the stuff we can do. I mean, even this conversation, like, it's like, these are just ideas. And this is cool and this is great and it's really needed, but like, we also we really need creative expression. We need music, we need dance, we need all kinds of things like that. And so I think there's so many ways, I'm not saying like what you should and should not do, but just for example, I think there's so many ways in which your experience as an artist and your skills there could actually be synthesized into this scene of sense making, of philosophy. And there's all these cool things that can be done. And, like I'm trying to figure out how to synthesize the music I make, the book I'm writing, YouTube, what you can do with video, podcast stuff. It's like all of this can synthesize into sort of an ecology of bringing people into light, basically waking up, discovering their creativity, and having that kind of feedback into the real world. and helping people become more complete, and finding meaning in their lives. And so I just think there's so much potential for that. And the more people we have who are interested in that and are experimenting, the more lively and fruitful I think all these endeavors are going to be.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic way to state it. That's like very exciting. And I think, man, I have a vision that's very much in line with that. And it's the thing I've kind of had to come to is like, yeah, like you said, you've made a big point about this. It can't be too much up here, right?
Yeah.
Like there's too much of this going on.
Yeah.
And there needs to be a little bit more of this like embodied cognition, a little bit more like finding flow and I don't know, like just following paths, even though there isn't some clear like set strategy. And that's what's really exciting to me is like sitting down and saying like, here's a project that's just like really exciting, and I can't explain why, but this is what I want to dive into,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, another connection made today, and, like I vibe with people like you, and more so than like the galaxy brains that cool. we find. And that's what's so exciting. Like you're saying, is like the network that emerges of people who are quite versatile and varied in their experiences and skills is like, it's cool. And what could happen from this? Something is happening, something could happen. And, I want to keep just donating as much energy as I can to it. And I'm already seeing results, it's like people feel touched by humanity if you are willing to like dish it out, and people are touched by, truth and hope and beauty, and the world needs it. So.
Well, awesome. Well, I'm loving the stuff you guys are doing. I hope people will check out Golden Shadow and any other cool stuff you guys decide to cook up. So, Arran, it's been like really fun connecting, and let's stay in touch.
Yeah, Brandon, thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thanks, man. You've been listening to How to Be an Artist. To support this podcast, you can go to patreon.com/H2BNA.